Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robin Dale. I'm the Deputy Librarian for Library Collections and Services here at the library, and on behalf of Dr. Carla Hayden, the Librarian of Congress, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you, those of you in person, and it's quite a nice group here today, as well as online. Our Phillips Society members, thank you for supporting today's deep dive into the geography and map collection at the library. Washington Map Society, welcome back, and thank you for sponsoring Laura McElfresh's talk tonight to congressional staff, friends of the Library of Congress, and library staff and alumni. Welcome. Many of you already know John Hessler, and for those of you who don't know John, he's a specialist in computational geography and geographic information science here at the Library of Congress. I will make it an aside, I think that's probably one of 3 or 4 different titles that you have here at the library. Much of his work centers on the application of high-performance computing and GIS to some of the most critical humanitarian and policy issues facing the world today. John has spent many years advising and providing support to congressional members and committees on a wide variety of issues, from SARS-CoV-2 to the development and the science of congressional redistricting. He's just finished a project where he developed a series of mapping applications for the House Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth. The author of more than 100 books and articles, he's also supervised more than 20 research fellows in the library who've worked on a wide variety of complex mapping projects, including the spread of COVID-19. That one was particularly impactful when we all saw that, and the migration of refugees in Syria and Rwanda. Today, John is going to talk to us about mapping the electoral demographics of the U.S. elections. With the midterm elections coming up in November, John, please do tell us about the role of maps in our elections.
Thank you, Robin. Thank everyone for coming. Thank you, people who are online. It is my great pleasure to give my last lecture as a library employee. I picked congressional redistricting because obviously is an extremely timely topic at the moment. And so we're going to take a different take on it. I'm going to try and explain to you why this is such a complex issue, not from a political standpoint, but really from a technical standpoint. Congressional redistricting obviously is mandated by the Constitution. It's one of the main reasons we do the census. But the complexity of actually drawing congressional maps is a computational problem that is so difficult that it almost overwhelms the technologies we have today. And that is really one of the central issues and one of the central problems that make congressional redistricting so hard. I'm going to start kind of with a little historical interlude, though, and we're going to start with an edition of the paper on March 26th of the Boston Gazette, where the gerrymander was born. It was really started by a man named Elridge Gerry. It really should be gerrymandering, but I'm going to say gerrymandering because everyone else does. This is like the Cicero-Cicero dilemma for people who study Latin. But basically, he was the governor of Massachusetts, and he signed into law a redistricting plan to basically keep his party in power. He signed it on February 11th, and on March 26th in the Boston Gazette, this cartoon appeared. And this is actually the cartoon of the gerrymander. And this was a district which was outside of Boston. We're going to talk a little bit about its structure and the sort of mathematics of this district and what Gerry actually did. I will say that if some of you come down to the open house that we're having in the Geography and Map Division, the Geography and Map Division holds the original woodblock carvings for that particular cartoon. It's one of the great things that we have in our collections, and they're extraordinarily finely done, but they were for this cartoon, so you'll be able to see those woodblocks. So the gerrymander was really this species of monster, and there's these great poems and these great things that were done about it. Dean Smith says, "Now I appeal to each bystander, if this not a salamander," which is where the gerrymander comes from, that this map looked like a salamander. But this has had a long legacy, and just to talk about what's going on right now in 2022, all of the maps, all of the states that you see in red, the redistricting plans that from the 2020 census are currently in litigation. The other ones have been settled, but you can see this is a massive problem. Whether blue state or red state, it is a problem across parties. Both parties seem to engage in gerrymandering in kind of an equal basis, as you will see in just a bit. So it's a real game and an amazingly interesting mathematical and computational problem. There was a lot of commentary on the beginnings of gerrymandering and a lot of understanding by some of the people who were writing about it. It was described as a horrid monster. Some believe it to be the monstrum horrendum of Virgil, and all believe it to be a creature of infernal origin, was written in papers. An awful misshapen monster, huge, with its eyes lost, its eyes not seeing the reality of the world and the reality of the political situation and the idea of fairness. All of these things were put together and written about this idea of gerrymandering and congressional redistricting. What's really interesting about it is a lot of the same problems were recognized. In the Boston Gazette, they did a natural history of the gerrymander, of the salamander, and basically they came to the conclusion, the same conclusions that we will see later on in this talk, that there are times where the majority of people are of one particular party, but because of gerrymandering, the representation flips. So in other words, there's a lot more people who vote one way, but the representation goes the other way just because of geography. And so this is where we're going to really begin kind of looking deeply into how does one make a gerrymandered map? What does one do in order to actually produce such a thing? So really, this began this long, long commentary about this problem. What is this problem? How do we solve it? On March 9th, 1812, maps were shown in, again, the Boston Gazette of the actual gerrymandered districts, and people began commenting on, wow, this is really terrible. We're seeing this misrepresentation, this problem of concentration of one party or another geographically, and other parties being sort of pushed off to the side. The above representation has been procured to show in what mode the present ruling party have dissected the Commonwealth, not carved it as a dish fit for the gods, but hewn it as a carcass for the hounds. This is the way this was described. And we're going to see those same descriptions by some of the arguments before the Supreme Court in just a bit. And the results, the understanding at this early period in 1812 of what this meant for the politics was really profound. A quote in, again, the Boston Gazette: "If such should be the result, these counties, containing an immense Federalist majority of more than 2,800 electors, would exhibit the strange spectacle of being represented by only 4 Federalists and 5 Democrat Republicans." So in other words, a huge majority of one way, but because of the geographical divisions of the electorate, the electorate goes the other way. So this was the moment. This is the moment in time, 1812. Cartography becomes politics, and politics becomes cartography. We are in that moment now, more profoundly than perhaps ever before in our history. And as many of you know, the map historians, the GIS analysts, the people from the Phillips and Washington Map Society here today, cartography has always been political. It's always been dividing up lands. It's always been something that was, this is mine and not yours. It's always been about territory. And so it's always been political. But in the 20th century, we had a revolution that came along, which was the GIS revolution, the revolution of lots of people with lots of computing power at their hands. And so we've gotten so much better at detecting it and doing it. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of this talk is kind of take you down the road of what that means and why this is such a problem and why it is so interesting from a technical, mathematical, and computational point of view. And my hope is, when you walk out of this room, you will look at a congressional district map much differently than you look at it now. And that really is the hope of this talk. What I'm going to give you from here on is parts of congressional briefings I've actually given. So in other words, talks that I've actually given to people across the street who are interested in this highest tech, this level of technical of calculation and computational calculation that has brought us to where we are now. I'm going to start with a little primer. of something called packing and cracking. So packing and cracking is the way that one basically makes a gerrymandered district. So the thing you see in front of you, I have 500 green and 500 pink voters. Note that I did not pick blue and red, okay? Okay, all right. We are the Library of Congress. I have to be careful, okay? Okay. So we have 500 green and 500 pink voters. And they're all evenly distributed, as you can see in this particular map, this square thing. Each one of those is a voter. But by drawing lines, just by drawing lines, I can divide this up into the fact that green wins 1 district and pink wins 9, just by drawing lines. It's the same with gerrymandering. Just with drawing lines on a map, I can divide up the electorate. The question is, of course, is the electorate picking the representative, or is the representative picking the electorate? Okay, that is the question that we're going to answer here. So the way we do that is we say to ourselves, okay, 51 votes is all you need to win. So if I pack a district, in other words, if I say I'm just going to let you win a district by a huge majority, so I say I'm going to put this so in this thing, it's all the way to the left. There's 95 green and 5 pink, okay? So what I've done is I've effectively wasted 45 green votes by drawing that line, because you only need the 50 to win, and I've only wasted 5 of mine, okay? And I can do that through this whole thing. I can pack districts, in other words, just me winning by 1. If I win by 1 and I put 49 of yours in there, I've wasted 49 of your votes. Okay? So by doing that, this is called packing and cracking. So in some cases, I pack it with your voters, and in other cases, I crack it. In other words, I break your vote up. And we're going to see examples of that in just a bit. And so what we see here is effectively, I have just wasted 450 by drawing these lines of the green votes. So 450 of their 500 votes don't count for anything here. Okay, just by drawing lines in a particular way. And so what this is called is the efficiency gap. It's basically how efficient are the votes that you are casting. How efficient are the green votes in this case? The green votes are completely inefficient. Okay, they have been packed and cracked away. They're almost meaningless to what happens here. Okay, so we've got 1 green district and 9 pink districts. So how did I do that? So let's just start with some rules, the rules for making congressional districts. So there's a whole bunch of case law about this. Okay, so first one is districts must be roughly the same size and population. This is the easy one. This is the one that everyone follows. Okay, you put the same number of people in each district. It's easily measurable. It's easily falsifiable. The second one is districts must be contiguous. In other words, a person must be able to walk between any 2 points in the district while remaining in the district, which means it can't be 2 parts. You're going to see some bizarre violations of this, okay, where a bridge is the thing that connects the 2 parts, or Interstate 95 for 6 miles connects the 2 parts. Yes, you could walk down Interstate 95, but would you want to? So that's the first 2. The third one is they must be compact. What does that mean? Okay, it means that somehow they can't be all linear and all dancing all over the map. But there's no real idea of what that actually means. They must represent communities of interest. Again, there's no satisfactory definition of what that means. So what we have here is we have four rules we have to follow in drawing these maps. One, of course, is falsifiable population. Everyone does that. It's perfectly fine. The other 3 are subject to profound differences in interpretation, and we're going to see that. What is a community of interest? People have said that it's county lines. Just counties have communities of interest. City lines. Even people have talked about commuter networks. The people who commute into Washington, D.C. every day have a certain community of interest. They've got interest in transportation, in mass transit, in certain services. They're a community of interest. But there's no satisfactory definition of what that means. And so with these kind of flexible rules, obviously there's subject to all kinds of shenanigans. So when we start building, I talked about that number 1, population, okay? That's still a problem, okay? Because what do we get our population numbers from? Well, we get them from the US Census. And there's a profound difference in the accuracy of the census depending on where you live. So this is a response area mapper. This is an agent-based modeling system that the census uses to figure out who is sending their forms in and who isn't. So I picked 2 census blocks in Washington, D.C. And you can see on the left-hand side, or your left-hand side, that the response rate, the ACS self-response rate, so a self-response rate is basically, do people send back the form? In that district is 83%. The whole median household income in that district is $164,000. Flip to the other side, the other district. Self-response rate, 30%. Income, $24,000. So we have a profound difference in the response rate to the census. What the census has to do at this point is they send people out to those low response areas and actually do hand counts. So we can see here that there's difficulties even in the population numbers. What does that mean? How do we map population? How accurate is the census? So this is something that we also have to consider when we're talking about sort of minority districts and things like that. This is just a quick slide. These are the different miscounts of the 2022 census or the 2020 census. So you can see places like Delaware, Hawaii, Minnesota have huge overcounts. Places like Mississippi, Florida, Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas, huge undercounts. The census tries to fix this, okay? They try and adjust the data. But this is an issue with even that first requirement. So why is this important? So what can I do if I have a computer and I take the data, those constraints that I just told you, those 4 constraints, and I make an algorithm out of them to do some sort of draw districts. And we're just going to use a simple one right now. So I can say to myself, I'm going to gerrymander and give the maximum advantage to the Democrats. And if I did that with the 2022 census, I would have 263 Democratic seats, 145 Republican seats, and only 27 competitive seats in the House of Representatives. I take that same data and I say to my algorithm, I want to maximize Republican. I would have 139 Democrat, 21 competitive, and 275 Republican seats. This is why this is important, because that's what you could do. And so that is why it's important to understand this problem. What do these constraints allow us to do? How different are the maps that we can make? And what do we do in order to somehow come to terms and somehow recompetitivize the mapping and make fair maps? What is a fair map? That's sort of our next subject. So there's a false dream that started in the 1960s with computers. And basically it was that we would be able to electronically figure out a way to unbiasedly make maps. It started in the 1960s, really with the work of a man named Edward Forrest, who began working with IBM, early IBM computers, and doing all kinds of apportionment maps. He came up with these certain constraints. Something called the efficiency gap was one of the things that he talked about this wasted votes. I'll just note that Chief Justice John Roberts, in oral arguments in 2017, called this sociological gobbledygook. Okay, this dream was completely taken up by computer scientists. By the 1970s, there were papers being published that you can see here. An algorithm is given which finds all optimal solutions. So makes all the possible maps that are possible and looks at them and sees the ones that are the best and then can pick them. You'll see in a few minutes that that's an impossible dream just because of the size of this problem, this search space. So the real central problem here is all the courts struggle to find a manageable and understandable idea for identifying partisan fairness when we're talking about gerrymandering because of the vagueness of the criteria. So the question we ask is, what would a good measure of gerrymandering look like? And that is really going to be an important question because it's not only a scientific and technical question, it's a profound scientific and technical question, as you will see. But whatever that answer is has to be understandable by human beings. It also has to be able to be codified into a legal system which can be defended in a court of law. So that is the interaction we're talking about here. When we talk about cartography becoming politics, this is the locus of everything. I mean, this is where it is the most important. So lots of measures of gerrymandering have happened. The efficiency gap we've already talked about. The idea is, how do we figure this out? Can we come up with an idea? There's lots of different ideas of compactness and things like that, but we need something a little bit more objective. So we're turning towards really super computer computational methods, things like evolutionary algorithms, graph theoretic ways of looking at this. And I'm going to kind of describe those to you in a way that I hope you get a sense of understanding of how complex this problem really is and how important it is. So redistricting is really what's called a graph partitioning problem, and it's NP hard. No one has to understand what that means. What it means is that there is no possible way a computer can possibly solve this problem, okay? So the example I have here, so say a state has 54 electoral tracts. So let's say the state has 54 census districts or electoral just districts and tracts, okay? And it wants to divide those into 6 districts, so it has 6 representatives, okay? How many maps are there to draw that fit those constraints? 8.7 times 10 to the 39, okay? An impossible number to calculate. So just that, when we're talking states like Pennsylvania, California, New York, North Carolina, we are up against what is an impossible computational situation. We don't even understand what the geometry of the search space is. So in other words, when we say to ourselves that this problem represents 8.7 times 10 to the 39th possible maps, we don't even know what the search space looks like, which ones are good, which ones are bad. There's going to be a whole bunch of them that are going to be super gerrymandered and a whole bunch that are going to be good, but we don't even know where to look in this search space. Where in this 10 to the 39 gazillions of maps do I even look for the good ones? How do I do that? So the dream is to have a very large sample of the high-quality maps that cover the search space. And there's no computational free lunch here. The search space is enormous. How do we optimize? So in other words, all of these maps, I have these 10 to the 39 maps, but they have to fit these constraints. How do I figure out which ones do and which ones don't? They have to be statistically independent. So there must be some meaningful difference between these. So if 10 to the 39 maps and 10 to the 16 of them are basically statistically identical, well, that's meaningless to me. That doesn't help. And they have to be representative. In other words, they have to represent the search space. So if I stand before Justice Roberts and I'm arguing before the Supreme Court and Justice Roberts says, well, the 10 to the 39 maps, which ones are good and which ones, I've got to be able to prove to him that he's not making a decision based on a probability distribution, okay? And so that is the central issue that we're dealing with here. So simplifying the problem for computational convenience, like was done early on, is not a solution. It's problematic from a legal point of view. And how does one exactly make a law on a probabilistic sampling of a huge search space by a computer of a whole bunch of maps that one human being couldn't possibly comprehend all of them? There is the central issue of the gerrymandering problem, okay? How do we do it? So there are a couple of ways we are doing it successfully, okay? And these, what I'm about to talk about now, the research I'm going to talk about with you now, is 2 or 3 years old. We're only talking about what's happening right now. This is not stuff that people have been doing for very long. So there are things called random walks. So in other words, I can pick a point in that search space and I can just bounce around and I can see what those maps look like. I can random walk around the search space. Well, that's not going to work very well because the search space is too huge. I can do something called a Markov chain, which is the thing we are going to use, which is a probabilistic way of sensing the geometry of the search space, looking for some highs and lows and clusters and things like that. And the 2 other methods, which are called flip step and recombination. These are the 2 points. These are the two locuses of mapping that are being used now. And I'm going to walk you through some of the computations, some of what's required, and then I'm going to show you some examples from current redistricting maps. And one important one that was just argued 2 weeks ago before the Supreme Court. So recombination is a random walk, okay, on a spanning tree of a graph partition. So what in God's name does that mean, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a graph out of the district. So here we've got a state you may all recognize, but basically what I'll do is I'll take all the electoral districts, I'll put a dot in them, and I'll connect each one of those centroid dots together and make a graph. So if I take the state away, I've got this graphic structure, okay? And basically, I'm going to try and explore this graph. I'm going to try and cut this graph up, because really what I'm going to do is basically I need to cut this thing up, this big net up, into each of the districts. So that is the way I'm going to do this. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to start with just some district plans. So this is a very simple example. So on the left-hand top there, I've outlined in color a bunch of districts. I'm going to take then a couple of those districts and I'm going to put that graph in there. I'm then going to cut that thing in various points until I break it into two. Then I'm going to repeat that process. And in doing that, I'm basically going to build up all possible districts that are possible based on this graph. So you don't have to worry about the details. This is basically the way it works. So what you see is you see it running down here in Pennsylvania. This is the computer program that is basically started with that initial partition that you see of just those colors, and we just run it for millions and millions and millions. So what this is doing right now, it is generating every possible map through that search space. And every one of those maps has certain constraints. In other words, I can generate a histogram. That set of maps equals this kind of compactness, this kind of fairness, this kind of thing, and I can generate a histogram. And that histogram is going to give me a statistical idea of all the possible maps that are in a particular state and are optional. So that's what's running right here. So this thing is basically making those graphs, chopping this up, and basically showing you different district possible plans for Pennsylvania. So that's what it's doing right now. So that's one method, okay? Another method is use evolutionary algorithms and evolutionary computation. And evolutionary computation is an algorithm that evolves. In other words, it's based on a certain natural selection model. So let's say I have a certain group of constraints. So I'm going to make an evolutionary algorithm that makes ostriches run. So I'm running this program, and as you can see, when I first start out, each of these things has a generation, just like in natural selection. 20 doesn't work. I keep learning, optimizing until I get to 1,000, and the ostrich keeps running. So these evolutionary algorithms basically learn. They evolve. So what I want to do is I want to say, here's the districts I want. I'm going to run this computer program, and I'm going to allow this thing to evolve to a point where the districts that I'm looking at are optimal. In other words, they fit all those constraints in a way that's fair, that is nonpartisan, is compact, is contiguous. I put all of those things into my algorithm, and it begins to learn. So what happens? What do we do when we do this? So this is a very difficult process. So running this program is not something you do on your laptop, okay? So the pair algorithms right now are being run at the University of Illinois Supercomputing Center on the Blue Water supercomputer, which has 1 quadrillion mathematical calculations per second computed on a sustained basis, okay? We can generate billions of maps per second in that search space, billions, which is what you see on the screen for North Carolina right here. Billions and billions of maps. When I generate billions and billions of maps, I'm beginning to get an idea of what the search space. So in other words, I'm starting in one area, I'm generating billions of maps, then I'll random walk to another area in the search space, billions and billions of maps, walk to another area in the search space, billions and billions of maps, and begin generating a histogram, okay? And what does that tell us, okay? That's really what we're gonna start getting into right now. What is all this calculation for? So no district map. The problem that the Supreme Court has and any court has is they're presented with a plan, okay? So I don't like the plan that Alabama did. I go to the Supreme Court, here's my plan. The Supreme Court looks at the plan, and it has to decide whether this plan is partisan gerrymandered or not. But no map, as you probably can see by now, can be judged in isolation. It needs to have all of the other maps around it. How did you come up with that map? Are there better ones? Are there ones that are more fair? How bad is this one? So we need deep statistics. So the reason that we do these calculations, these deep evolutionary calculations, these recombination Markov chain calculations, is to generate these statistics, to get statistical baselines, okay? So what happens is we generate this large number of maps and we begin to see things like this. So this is the original actual North Carolina map that's on the left-hand side. Republicans have a 7-6 majority. But generating this, I can find a search space where Republicans win big, 11-12. I can find one where Democrats win big, 10-3. Or I can find one where, that are built for just compactness. I just stress that part of the requirements. So when I do this, I need to be careful. I need to understand what my algorithms are doing, and I need to generate, as I said, deep statistics. What does that mean? So let's just look at what that means. So here we have 1,174,702 possible maps for a state which I'm not going to mention, okay? Basically, what is done here is we calculated billions and billions of maps. A lot you can throw out immediately because they're just so far out of whack, okay? And then we generate a histogram. So what you see here is you see competitiveness and the efficiency gap. So competitiveness is a measure, like I showed before, how many districts are competitive. In other words, a toss-up, not definitely going to be Republican, not definitely going to be Democrat. How much of them, basically, the electorate has the control of what's going to happen. Efficiency gap, is the number of wasted votes. So here we've generated these millions of maps, and we've generated this histogram. So you can see the histogram for competitiveness here. The billions of maps, that is the distribution. Some maps are terrible. Some maps are very good. But you can see that there's about 200,000 maps that are at the peak of that histogram. So that are the most competitive. There's this 200,000. So you can say that for this particular search space, that peak, that top peak, is really the best, most competitive maps you can have. So when you look at the actual maps, so the green here is the 2001 plan. You can see the green is way out of the competitive. So you can already see there's a problem with that plan. So now in the new plan, 2022, you can see it's moved even further away from the histogram. So by generating that, we haven't generated anything except these deep statistics, which now allow us to judge the current plan. Okay? We haven't done anything to the current plan. All we've done is generated statistics of all the possible maps that this state legislature could have come up with. The best ones are at that peak, and then they tail off, but they didn't even come into the range with this thing. Efficiency gap, the exact same thing. We generated all of these millions of maps, 1,174,000, came up with this histogram. You can see that in 2001, it was great. The efficiency gap was in really good shape. It was a really nice efficiency gap. There weren't a lot of wasted votes, and it was the best it could be almost, okay? But in 2022, you can see the red line, it has moved away. So there's more wasted votes. And I'm not going to tell you which party is which here or which state, because I want to just make sure I'm not, not giving anyone any weaponry, because this, I will tell you what you're looking at here is currently under litigation. So that's why I'm kind of being a little bit careful, okay? So that really is what we need to do. When a plan comes before a court, it needs to have this kind of statistical evidence in order to be able to judge the plan, because a plan can't be judged in isolation. You can't take a single map and determine just by looking at it whether it's fair or not. You need to have statistics. You need to have this kind of thing. And so just a couple examples, and I'm not picking on North Carolina, okay? And I'm not picking on Alabama or Oregon, as you'll see in just a bit, okay? So what we see here is we see 1992, 1997, 2001, and I want you to look at District 12, okay? Compact, continuous, Okay, so it evolved from its 1992 height of being a string through the state, okay, to 2001. In the current thing, the top map up there, that is the map that the legislature put forward on the left-hand side. And what you see in the bottom is a sample of 1 million possible maps. And you can see the red arrow shows where that particular plan was. So as far as fairness goes, it is out of the fair range. It is in the unfair range. So basically, that was shown. It went to court in North Carolina. A special master was appointed. The map that is down the bottom is the accepted North Carolina map. It is right in the middle of the fair range, as you see the dot. So the process worked. Okay, it took an unfair map that was statistically unfair. The special master took it over and created a map that is directly in the fair range. So the statistical approach did work. But we don't have statistics for every state, and this is obviously based on the populations and all that kind of thing that we talked about earlier. So the Alabama Supreme Court just heard a case about Alabama. Alabama districts are somewhat odd. You can see on the right-hand side, there's a graph. There's one of California below, and Alabama is at the bottom. The red dots are the dots that are completely Republican, and the blue dot is the one that is Democratic. The vote shares are unbalanced, okay? So if you look at, when we talked about packing and cracking, so let's look at just a piece of the blue district there. So the population in that blue district is 717,754. You see all the districts that I pointed out have the equal population. But the population of white voters in this district is 265, and black voters 400,000. You'll see the flip in the other districts, okay? Now, this is a racial gerrymandering case, okay, not a partisan gerrymandering case. When we go down even a little bit further, we can see here that this area in Montgomery County has been packed and cracked. And so basically, instead of keeping the county together, it has been broken up, so the majority black population is put together in a bigger white population zone. In other words, making the efficiency gap very low for African American voters in that district. And so this is the case that was argued before the Supreme Court just 2 weeks ago. How it's going to turn out, no one knows. Racial gerrymandering cases are very different than partisan gerrymandering cases because they tend to be a little bit clearer in their form, whereas partisan gerrymandering, we know based on the census what people's races are. We don't know what their party affiliation is. So that's always a fluid idea. And the fact that we're not supposed to take party affiliation into account when building districts also plays into the fact that the Supreme Court has consistently thrown any partisan gerrymandering case back to the state. So Oregon, kind of a little bit in the opposite side. You can see we've done 1 million maps here. They're out of the fair range. Oregon is currently in litigation. They've split up many of their counties, so when we talk about communities of interest, that's a problem. And so, again, we can see this is sort of the opposite kind of thing, that basically this happens in every state with a large population and with a large number of districts, depending on who's in power. Obviously, people want to be in power. So, but the difference now is that unlike in 1812 or in the 1960s, we've got the tools to actually understand the process much better. None of the stuff that I've talked about has been solved. None of this stuff has been solved. None of the things I'm talking about, these computer algorithms, the evolutionary computational methods, none of them have been solved. None of them are actually things that anyone has complete confidence in. But we are developing more and more and more tools to do this better. Why is it so important? Well, I'm just going to show you 2 maps to end the talk. The first one, the ones on the left we talked a little bit about if I were to make these maximum partisan. But what if I maximize for party affiliation? Okay, so I'm going to say, I'm going to maximize these districts to keep people in the same parties in the same place. A community of interest is a person who belongs to a political party. There's a lot of different ideologies that attach you to that. It can't be any more apparent that you're a community of interest. So if I maximize for party affiliation, I have 174 Democratic districts and 179 Republican and 82 competitive. But what if I want to go better than that? What if I want to do that supposed false dream of the 1970s, and I want to make everything maximized for competitiveness? So I want to go and I want to make every race as competitive as possible. So based on the constraints, based on the census data, based on the algorithms, I come up with this map. 94 Democrats, 99 Republicans, and 242 competitive districts. This is just by geography. I'm not moving people around. This is just by drawing lines on a map. Maps are important. They are running a lot of our lives right now. And so the revolution in cartography that's allowed us to do that has become critically important. GIS has really changed the world, both for the better and for the worse sometimes. But this is an important issue, and it's an issue that is critical now and is being influenced by technologies that are just running behind the scenes. So the next time you look at a congressional district map, don't think about it in isolation. Think about the map that could have been next to it if one of the districts had been changed. Think about what would have happened if the census was completely accurate in a minority district. Think about the variation. Think about the number of these things that are possible. And I hope you'll look at them a little bit more critically. I want to thank you all for listening, and I want to thank you all for 22 years of listening to me here at the library. It has been a great run, and as I said, thank you very much.